What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here, and usually on Mondays I do X-Men related reviews. This weekend I did not get around to reading an X-Men book because I had family visiting, and I was going to just completely skip on doing a video for Monday for you guys, but 2 weeks ago I didn't get around to doing an X-Men related video, so I didn't want to skip twice in such a short period of time, so I was going to bust out the 4-issue Rise of Apocalypse miniseries from the 1990s. I thought, well, this is a really short miniseries. I could read this and review it in preparation for X-Men Apocalypse, which hasn't yet come out in America. And then I looked on my channel and I had already reviewed Rise of Apocalypse. So just when I thought I wasn't going to be doing an X-Men related video for you guys, I thought, you know what, I have a rant that I don't think I've ever mentioned on my channel before. I've mentioned it to friends before, but I don't think I've ever actually mentioned it in the confines of my YouTube channel. So I thought, in honor of X-Men Apocalypse, I was going to talk a little bit about Sabanur himself, the seemingly immortal mutant nemesis of the X-Men. Apocalypse is one of those characters who, he is like top 5 X-Men villain material. When you ask someone who are the top 5 X-Men villains, Apocalypse is always going to land in everybody's top 5. And much as I am a huge X-Men fan, I would say that the reason that Apocalypse is always going to land on everyone's top 5 is because there aren't that many good X-Men villains. You've got Magneto, you've got Apocalypse, you've got Mr. Sinister, maybe Nimrod. I really like Nimrod a lot, but he wasn't around for a very long time. He was just like a year and a half that he was hanging out in the Marvel Universe, if that, and then he was brought back in the 2000s, again, not for a very long period of time. So you don't really have that many actual face villains. When I say face villains, you've got characters like the Sentinels, or a whole bunch of racist white dudes who don't like mutants, but they aren't really much of a threat themselves. Or you've got like Nimrod, who is a unique Sentinel, but then all the other Sentinels are just a big group of Sentinels. But you don't really have a whole lot of villains who are much of a threat by themselves, other than those characters that I mentioned. And Apocalypse is one of those guys who, when he was first introduced back in the 1980s, he was really awesome, he was really menacing, and it was this kind of slow burn where we eventually found out just who this guy is and just how amazingly awesome he is and how powerful he is and how scary he is. And then after that, I feel like everything else was just kind of didn't really quite land like it initially did. I was talking to Connor Nielsen about this, who I do my Twin Peaks podcast with, our Twin Peaks podcast, and he said, whenever I was explaining to him my problem with Apocalypse, he said, so he's kind of like Bane from DC Comics. And I thought about it for a minute, and I was like, he is exactly like Bane from DC Comics. Bane is a character who was introduced, and he had this really thought out, methodical plan where Batman has got the flu, and then Bane releases all these villains from Arkham Asylum. Batman has to fight all of them, and then right after he's defeated all of them, Bane comes out of nowhere and breaks Batman's back, and he is the first villain to break Batman's back. Well, he's the only one to do that, but he's the first villain to defeat Batman. And I feel like Apocalypse is kind of sort of like that, where everything that you are going to do after that is always going to be disappointing because it doesn't measure up to that first story. Bane is never, ever going to be as interesting as he was during the Nightfall stuff, where Azrael takes over the mantle of Batman. Eventually, Bruce Wayne reclaims the mantle, and then he has to go and defeat Bane to kind of prove that he's got what it takes. Nothing is ever going to measure up to that with Bane, because that is the most awesome thing that Bane can do. Bane can't do anything more awesome than breaking Batman's back. He's kind of sort of a one-note character, and that's kind of where I want my rant to kind of fall on Apocalypse. I feel like Apocalypse is kind of a one-note character. The early appearances of Apocalypse, actually before he ever fought any of our protagonists, originally, I should go ahead and mention, he was actually a villain for X-Factor, not even the X-Men. At this point, the original 5 X-Men had kind of broken off from the X-Men because, long story short, the original X-Men thought that the new X-Men were working with Magneto, which they were, but the original X-Men were like, oh, the X-Men, they have fallen really far. They're all bad guys guys. They're working with Magneto. They didn't realize that Magneto was a good guy at this point. And then meanwhile, the original 5 X-Men, now calling themselves X-Factor, they are going out there pretending to hunt down mutants, and then Storm sees a poster of theirs, and she's like, oh wow, the original X-Men, now they're hunting mutants. Man, Charles Xavier would be so disappointed if he saw this. So basically, it was this huge misunderstanding where the original X-Men and the new X-Men didn't really like or trust each other at this point for valid reasons, but at the same time, if they all just sat down for 5 minutes and talked with each other, they probably would have been able to work together a lot better. But around this time, the original 5 X-Men, now calling themselves X-Factor, like I said, they are pretending to hunt down mutants. What they're doing is they take these mutant threats and then they take them to their headquarters and they train them to use their powers better so they can go back and blend into society. Around this time, you've got Apocalypse just kind of showing up every now and then. He was actually the leader of this team of losers called the I think the Allies of Evil or something like that, or the Axis of Evil. Some really stupid sounding name for a team of really loser supervillain mutants. I can remember, I think, 2 of the characters from that team. There was Tower, who was just a dude who could get really big, and then there was the other girl who, her name, I can't even remember right off the top of my head, but she actually joined the X-Men in the mid to late 2000s. She was kind of sort of romantically involved with Gambit in the Age of X alternate reality. She was romantically involved with Cyclops. I can't remember her name, but it's a character who I do remember her being part of the Axis of Evil. But anyway, that could kind of show you just how C-list these characters working with Apocalypse were. They weren't really very threatening or menacing at all, and originally, apparently, the idea was that this Axis of Evil team was actually going to be reporting to the Owl, who is a Daredevil character. And then at the very last minute, someone, an editor or an artist or somebody said, no, let's just create a brand new character. So instead of it being the Owl, it ended up being Apocalypse. And you might be thinking, well, Apocalypse has this thing of survival of the fittest. Why in the world would he be working with all these lamos like the Axis of Evil or the Dark Riders or characters who are just kind of stupid and pointless? And I have an answer to that. I don't know. I don't know why he would be working with characters like this. But after his first appearance, where he's basically just Charlie to the Axis of Evil's Charlie's Angels, he's just kind of sending them out on these missions to do evil things. After that, he starts going around and collecting all these seemingly weak mutants and saying, okay, I've got big plans for you. But then you don't actually know what his big plans are. There's this one girl who's in her house playing video games, I think, and he comes and says, hey, do you want to join me? And she's like, sure. And he does it with this old lady during the mutant massacre, and then he does it with this guy who's living in an iron lung. And then finally, Warren Worthington III, he actually lost his wings during the mutant massacre, and then he tries to commit suicide, and then Apocalypse recruits this guy. And if you are familiar with Apocalypse at all, you probably know that he was getting around to recruiting his 4 horsemen. Finally, a group of villains who are actually a threat, who don't look like a bunch of idiots like the Axis of Evil. I don't even know if that was their actual name. I keep calling them the Axis of Evil. I think that was their name, but it was just a bunch of really stupid characters who had no business even calling themselves villains. That's how pointless and not a threat they were. But anyway, finally, around the time after Apocalypse has recruited Angel, that's around the point when Apocalypse first meets up with X-Factor. It was actually during the Fall of the Mutants crossover. And I say crossover because it wasn't much of a crossover. It was kind of a different story in each X-Men title. Apocalypse was fighting X-Factor, the New Mutants, they were off getting Doug Ramsey killed, and then the X-Men were fighting the adversary in Texas. So it was kind of a different story for each book with very, very loose connections going on with all 3 to make it sort of a crossover. But that was around the time when Apocalypse first fought X-Factor, and it was this big deal. Eventually, Warren, he turns on Apocalypse, and then Caliban, who was a member of the Morlocks and was kind of the team mascot, sort of, for X-Factor, because at this point, most of the Morlocks were already dead, so he was living with them. He decides, you know what, I'm sick and tired of being this scrawny, weak little thing. I'm going to join Apocalypse. And then he becomes the new Horseman of Death. I think the Horseman of Death, yeah, because Angel, he leaves Apocalypse, and he was Death, and so Caliban becomes the next Death. And he joins Apocalypse, and it was around this time when I feel like Apocalypse kind of hit his peak. This idea of, and it was around this time also when he revealed to X Factor that he was in fact a really, really old mutant. And I think it was much, much later when it was revealed that he wasn't actually immortal. He was really long lived, but he would actually go into these really long bouts of suspended animation. And so in theory, he could die of old age. And we actually saw much, much later in the mid 90s, it was in the further adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix, I think, or maybe it was just the adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix. We saw Apocalypse was actually really old, and he was actually burning through his bodies, and he would have to keep finding a new body. So anyway, at the time, it was believed that he was actually just straight up immortal. That's since then kind of been retconned so that he's not as powerful as what it was led to believe around this time. But this was around the time when we were finding out that not only was Apocalypse basically immortal, but there was this really neat idea that has kind of been ignored by every writer who's handled Apocalypse since then. This idea that depending on what era he was around, he didn't necessarily look like a blue and gray bald dude with big huge lips like he looks like now. He might look like what's his name? The Egyptian god of death, Horus, maybe, the Jackal. He might look like that, or he might have a different face if he was in China or something like that. There's this kind of neat scene in this X Factor comic where he's explaining to the X Factor team that depending on what civilization that he was around for, he would look like their embodiment of death. He would look like this big, huge, terrifying being who is going to basically cull the weak from civilization. And in that way, I guess you could kind of sort of say that he's a lot like the League of Shadows from Christopher Nolan, Christian Bale's Batman Begins, which maybe, and I'd say that in that regard, the League of Shadows is even more similar to Apocalypse than they are Ra's al Ghul, but that's neither here nor there. But anyway, it's around this time where X Factor eventually defeats Apocalypse, and then he and his remaining horsemen, they kind of go off with their tails tucked in between their legs, and then X Factor actually gets to keep his ship. It's this big, huge ship that only mutants can enter, and it becomes their headquarters for pretty much the rest of the original 5 X-Men as X Factor. It pretty much becomes their headquarters for the rest of that run, which is up until the very late 80s, very early 90s, when the original 5 X-Men, they disband as X Factor, and then it's a brand new relaunch for the title, where it becomes a government-sponsored superhero mutant team. So they have Apocalypse's headquarters for a while. And it's right around that point where I feel like Apocalypse kind of stopped being interesting, because after that point, you start seeing Apocalypse show up a lot, and he did do other stuff. Famously, Apocalypse is the one who infected Cyclops' son with the techno-organic virus, and that kind of is what led to the creation of the character of Cable. And so if you're ever angry about the creation of the character of Cable, you know who to blame for that. And I feel like that was not necessarily so much we want to make Apocalypse seem more threatening, so he's going to infect this baby with a techno-organic virus, because honestly, as I've said about Anakin Skywalker, how threatening is your villain when all he does is go after children and babies who can't defend themselves. So I don't think that that was so much, let's try to make Apocalypse seem more threatening. I think it was more, Cyclops seems like he's got a lot of baggage whenever he has a dead ex-wife who was a goblin queen and this baby from that marriage, so let's go ahead and get rid of the baby so that he and Jean can get back together. I really think that that's kind of what they were doing there with that move to get rid of Nathan Christopher Summers. But anyway, around that time, starting with the 90s, I think that's when Apocalypse stopped being interesting. And a lot of people say he's really awesome, but I think if you ask those people who really like Apocalypse what they like about Apocalypse, I think almost everyone would say they either like him because of the animated series, which that's a whole nother ballgame right there. I am not a huge fan of the animated series. I don't think that it's actually a very good series. I think mostly people like it because they remember it being really good from their childhood, but it does not hold up today. People either like Apocalypse because of that, because of the Age of Apocalypse crossover in the 90s, which was really awesome, or Apocalypse's earliest appearances throughout the X Factor series, mostly written by Louise Simonson, which was before he kind of stopped being good. So if Bane kind of had just one good story in him where he breaks Batman's back, I would say that Apocalypse had a long-running series of stories in him. But once you get to the point where the original 5 X-Men join up up with the other X-Men, and you've got 2 X-Men books, and then X-Factor becomes the government team. Right around that time, early 90s, when Chris Claremont leaves the X-Men books, I think that's when Apocalypse stops being an interesting character, because from that point forward, you only see Apocalypse go through a very specific kind of story. He comes around and he says, hey, something, 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 survival of the fittest. And then he has a whole bunch of horsemen, and then the X-Men kick his butt, and then he goes away. And then usually you're going to have at least one X-Man who is one of the horsemen. You've had Wolverine, Gambit, Archangel, Polaris. They've all been horsemen at one point or another. Banshee was a horseman, but that was a different thing because it was 4 Horsemen of Death, and that was in the Uncanny Avengers. You've had a whole bunch of X-Men characters who have all been horsemen at one point or another. And I feel like if you look at every Apocalypse appearance from the 90s moving forward to Blood of Apocalypse, which was basically the last official Apocalypse appearance, because after that it's been clones and rebirths and stuff that don't really count for the main Apocalypse. But if you look at everything from the early 90s all the way up to 2006, basically Apocalypse is just a completely wasted character. He doesn't seem threatening at all. He comes in and he starts preaching about survival of the fittest, and then the X-Men beat him with no problem at all, and then he goes away and it's like, okay, I'll try it again, and I'm going to do the exact same thing once again. And some villains out there, they can do the exact same thing over and over again, and it works. Some villains, they do different things, and they work so well because they're so versatile, and they've got so many different angles that you can work with them. Apocalypse is a character who I really do think that he needs to have more going on than just he comes in, he starts preaching Darwinism, he has 4 horsemen, one of them is an X-Man, who could it be? Professor Xavier's a horseman of Apocalypse, whoa! And then the X-Men defeat Apocalypse, and then he comes back and he does the exact same thing. Rinse and repeat again and again and again. Around the time, like I said, Blood of Apocalypse, that's basically your last official Apocalypse story. Apocalypse floats off into space, he thinks he's gonna die, and then the Celestials say, hey, we made a deal thousands of years ago, you're not getting out of this deal. And I won't even get into that. I've talked about that deal that Apocalypse made with the Celestials before, but in the end, we never actually get to see that version of Apocalypse again, because after that, Apocalypse is reborn as a little boy in the Uncanny X-Force series by Rick Remender. And then some huge spoilers for Uncanny X-Force. I thought about not spoiling there for a second, but I'm going to have to if I'm going to talk about Apocalypse here. So if you haven't read Uncanny X-Force, stop this video right now. Go read Uncanny X-Force because it's awesome. So anyway, now that you're back, now that you've read Uncanny X-Force, all of it, Phantom X kills this boy Apocalypse because they're all kind of like, should we kill him? He's a little boy, but at the same time, he's Apocalypse, and Apocalypse's followers were all like training this boy so that he would be the reincarnation of their Lord and Master, because I guess the original Apocalypse, once he's off planet or once he's millions of miles away out in the middle of space, a new version of Apocalypse kind of shows up. And then we get a clone of the little boy, and that is the version that you've probably seen in various X-Men comics over the last 5 years or so. He showed up a little bit in Uncanny X-Force after Phantom X killed the other boy Apocalypse, and then he showed up in Jason Aaron's Wolverine and the X-Men. I think right now he's in Dennis Hopeless's All New X-Men. And personally, I really like this new version of Apocalypse. And I've been really, really rooting hard for him not to become the new Apocalypse. I really don't want them to turn this little boy into the next Apocalypse. And I know right now, or maybe it's not happened yet, but the X-Men books are going through a big Apocalypse war. I have no idea what's going on there. I don't know if it concerns Evan becoming the next Apocalypse, Evan being the clone of the boy Apocalypse. I have no idea. But personally, I thought that this kid trying to fight his destiny of becoming mutant Satan, I thought that was much, much, much more interesting than, hey guys, survival of the fittest, I've got 4 horsemen again, one of them's an X-Man again, and then the X-Men defeat him. Not to mention, Apocalypse is touted as being this really awesome, really strong, really powerful character that nobody can beat, and yet the X-Men beat him all the time, it seems like. The only time that he's ever seemed threatening was during that era where he was fighting X-Factor in the 1980s, and then the Age of Apocalypse. I remember in the Executioner song, he was going around coughing all the time, and then the Dark Riders were like, hey, you're weak, we need to kill you because that's our motto, survival of the fittest. And then Apocalypse is like coughing up blood. Like, he just seemed like a shadow of his former self. And this video has gone way, way longer than I thought it would. But basically, I wanted to try and explain why I don't really care about the character of Apocalypse. Now, having said that, I think that the character of Apocalypse can be salvaged and made to work again. For example, the clone of Apocalypse from Wolverine and the X-Men and Uncanny X-Force, I thought that he was a very interesting character. I really like the arc that he's been going with over the years. And I'm still kind of hoping that this Apocalypse War thing doesn't have anything to do with turning Evan into the new Apocalypse. I guess we'll see. But anyway, personally, I do think that the character of Apocalypse can work. I just feel like for the period of about 16 years or so, he didn't work. He was just the same old, and it got really boring to me. So I wanted to explain that. I thought it would be appropriate since we got the X-Men Apocalypse movie coming out. I hope that you guys like this very long-winded video. If you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And next week, I am going to try to get back to reviewing X-Men books. No promises, but I am going to try to get back to actually reviewing X-Men books. So look forward to that next Monday. And I've also got other videos throughout the rest of this week. So be sure to check those out if you're interested. In the meantime, I will see you guys in the future. Have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.